Thank you, Melanie. Good morning. Welcome to Bellingham Unitarian Fellowship. I'm Reverend Paul Beckel. Today, I will be speaking about conservative values. Obviously, that will be a very short sermon. Since we're on Zoom, I can't tell if you find that hilarious or shocking, but don't worry, as a good liberal, I'll be providing a lot more nuance as we go. Let's start today by singing together number 26 in the gray hymnal, Holy, Holy, Holy.
Thank you, Melanie. I'm Jeff Copeland. I'm honored to be your celebrant this morning. We will open this morning with some words from William F. Buckley from his book, Up from Liberalism, which seems to encapsulate some of his personal philosophy. He writes, "Conservatism is the tacit acknowledgement that all that is finally important in human experience is behind us, that the crucial explorations have been undertaken, and that it is given to man to know what are the great truths that emerged from them. Whatever is to come cannot outweigh the importance to man of what has gone before." And join me in reciting our covenant. Love is the spirit of this fellowship, and service gives it life. Celebrating our diversity and joined by a quest for truth, we work for peace and honor all creation. This is our covenant.
Our theme for the month of November has been healing. One thing that both liberal religious traditions and conservative religious traditions have emphasized is that throughout our lives, we need to be healed from blindness. I invite you now to get very comfortable, breathing easily. This time you might not choose to close your eyes because I have some images to share, but let's join as one now as we feel one with the universe. Jesus said, "Don't call out the speck of sawdust in the eye of an adversary without first removing the log from your own eye." Buddhists perhaps would phrase it that we need to perpetually destroy the illusions that get in our way and keep us from seeing. We are in constant transformation. Breathing together, we don't need to become overwhelmed by this. We are forever in transformation. Sometimes this feels good. Sometimes it's terrifying. Sometimes it's fun to be in charge of making it all up as we go along. Sometimes we feel as if the fate of the universe, or even our next meal, is out of our hands. Throughout the ages, people have gathered or gone alone to sacred places. It's part of our human need to be grounded in something amidst this constant transformation. For refuge, for stillness, to feel both humble and adequate at the same time. Sacred places to feel small, while at the same time feeling part of something larger. Something larger. So large and extraordinary, such a transformation that our lives will encompass just a fraction of it. And yet, being grounded, we know that this is okay. Places to go to express our gratitude and our faithfulness. Sacred places to remind us of our limits and the blessing that it is when we can rebuild together. In monuments to the cosmos and mystery and wonder. Reflecting our reverence for the earth, the power of ritual, and the power that comes from being together. Discovering the divine in relationship, in stillness, and in death. In our homes, in our hearts, we go for healing. We go to set down the burdens of our illusions.
Good morning. My name is Alan Friedlob, and for today's Racism Minute, I'm going to share with you an experience I had last summer. Celebrating freedom in Linden, Washington, surrounded by dairies and berries, a floatless and marcherless July 4th parade of flag-draped vehicles assembled. Their drivers then wove a red, white, and blue trail past lawn chairs curbside by manicured lawns. The next day, a Sunday, young activists and their supporters assembled at the high school for a march for Black Lives. One activist held a sign that read, Luke 4:16-19. This passage speaks to Jesus coming to the synagogue in Nazareth, where he recites the words of the prophet Isaiah. The Spirit of the Lord is on me, because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of sight for the blind, to set the oppressed free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. Another sign read simply, Jesus was brown. Stopping at City Hall, the marchers are met across a no man's land by about 100 persons, young and old, many who had likely taken part in Saturday's Freedom Parade, a few displaying assault rifles and handguns. 17-year-old Amsalek Burke spoke to what she experienced growing up as a Black girl in Linden. Until now, she had resigned herself to keeping quiet about racism. She said, "Nobody around here ever talks about any of this. It's just what it is." Now she gave loud voice to what it feels like to be followed by white salespeople while jean shopping, something her white friends had hardly noticed when it happened right in front of them as she tried on Old Navy at Bellis Fair. While persons could cross over the divide and listen, only a few ventured that way. Shouts of Black Lives Matter, all lives matter, defund the police, support the police, ping-ponged instinctively. So this pandemic summer, the Northwest Fair, Linden's family-friendliest fest, was canceled. Over 200,000 people who would have attended were elsewhere. Yet on Freedom Weekend, some calling Linden home woke up, recognizing their neighbors' kids were far less willing to be quiet about things than most anyone had assumed. While 4-H kids didn't show their dairy cows, young advocates opened hearts, minds, and doors. While quilts lovingly made stayed on their beds, hung with blue ribbons, empathy and unity across racial, ethnic, and gender divides spread little by little. While raspberry preserves and blueberry pies went unjudged, outspoken young voices gelled new identities and friendships for peacefully bettering our world. Young people told Linden what they were thinking, and it's so easy to be racist, if you don't know any better. Margaret Rinkle, in a New York Times op-ed entitled, "These Kids Are Done Waiting for Change," observes, "You may argue that these activists are simply too young to understand the risks they are taking, but I think they know exactly what they are doing. What they are too young for is cynicism. What they are too young for is defeat. They are young enough to imagine a better future, to have faith in their own power to change the world for good, and that faith should give the rest of us more hope than we have had in years." So as Paul said last week in his love letter for future generations, keep up the good work. Your purpose is here and now, and what you do deepens our awareness.
Thank you, Alan. Rebuilding from loss, trauma, rebuilding from long periods of neglect, even rebuilding from long periods of semi-quarantine, is and will be an incremental process, beginning with an acknowledgement of what has been lost.
Thanks.
Jane Ronka Washburn and Lawrence Allen will sing now some revised lyrics to a traditional Christian hymn tune played by Melanie Reek. They sing of grief, goodwill, conviction, and hope.
Rebuilding starts with weeping, with tears that fall like rain, with full and honest grieving for years of loss and pain, for suffering and sorrow that never had to be. Rebuilding starts with weeping for all who are not free.
Rebuilding starts with praying, with hope's aloud our voice, with visions for our country, with reason to rejoice. We offer up our spirits, our hearts and minds and hands. Rebuilding starts with praying for strength to heal our land. Rebuilding starts with loving, with care for every soul, with yearning in compassion, that all may yet be whole, that enemy and neighbor may know a better day. Rebuilding starts with loving, for love will show the way.
I'm going to speak today a bit about the evolution of human consciousness and its ramifications for culture, religion, politics, and social ethics. That is, our growth into an ethic of caring for one another and continually widening the circle of our care. It turns out along the way, the topic of my sermon has evolved as well. What I had originally envisioned as liberal praise for conservative values has evolved a bit into a critique of liberal values. Some might prepare for the original topic by putting up a wall of skepticism. Now perhaps that will have hardened to a wall of defensiveness. Please don't let that happen. So today I'm not going to be going one by one through a series of what I might characterize as noble conservative values. Regrettably, over the years, there is less and less correspondence in the political realm between what something is called and what something actually is. So you wouldn't buy it and you wouldn't recognize it if I were to say that an old-fashioned conservative value is the durability of truth though I think it was. You wouldn't buy it if I were to say that an old-fashioned conservative value is caution or civic duty, which these two, I think, were represented well in conservative past. Instead, though, I encourage you to consider today that there has been an evolution of human consciousness from the earliest humans who had to focus on their own security and survival through a period of thousands of years later, when we kind of had that down and had formed into larger and larger bands of individuals, such that the preservation of order became the priority, that we had advanced from security, that we could focus more on order. In the long stretches of time since then, we have evolved further in an expanding sense of human society. Once we had security and social order and kept becoming bigger, our consciousness could become broader and freer, such that human beings, we came to understand, could be made for something higher, seeking individual fulfillment. Eventually we get to this. On our way to the top of this journey of values, well, so to speak, top. I trust that there will be more coming. Along the way, if we neglect what those values that are most basic, we're in trouble. So it's understandable that when we feel unsettled or afraid, people want to revert to the focus on survival, security, and order. For the purposes of our conversation today, I ask you to think of the values represented at our earliest stages of human consciousness as conservative, and the values represented at our more evolved states of consciousness to be liberal. I understand that this may not correspond with your current conceptions of these words, and that it is definitely an oversimplification, but please give this a shot just for now. And as you do, recognize that these values are not opposite and do not have to be opposed to one another. About 25 years ago, I was at an interfaith gathering of ministers where the topic was postmodernism. I'd heard that word thrown around before, but I felt awkward because I didn't really know what it meant. The rough definition that was presented there and then was that the postmodern viewpoint held that truth is always relative and context dependent, that it's not even useful to speak about truth since everything is a matter of perspective and subjective interpretation. Truth is constructed by each of us within the frame of our inescapable biases. Therefore, truth as understood by people on the margins, which is often dismissed, is no less valid than the truth perpetuated by those in power. This postmodernist viewpoint affirmed skepticism, pluralism, and radical equality of different views. Our interfaith ministers' conversation then was about how religion might play out if the coming decades were dominated by the postmodern mindset. I confess I was a little smug. I treasured skepticism, pluralism, and radical equality, in particular among diverse people's understanding of so-called religious truths. The more conservative ministers there were distinctly uncomfortable with this. So even though I was behind the curve a few minutes earlier because I hadn't known what postmodern meant, it turned out that they were more behind than I was. Ha! And yet, I walked away from that conversation asking myself, is this kind of thinking eventually going to come around and bite us? Is this why people say that Unitarians just believe anything they want? How did we get here? Contemporary American writer Ken Wilber describes how early humans, driven by an instinct for survival, had a consciousness that was entirely egocentric. Then, over many thousands of years, we evolved through stages that might broadly be described as moving from egocentric, centering on ourselves and our own security and survival, that we went from being egocentric creatures to ethnocentric, and that was progress. That as we began to see beyond ourselves and began to take into account the well-being of wider circles of kinship across generations and all the way into genetically related communities and allies. And then over many more thousands of years, our understanding of our own circle of security gradually expanded outwards as we began to identify with those who shared our language, race, geography, or religion. Along the way, to bind groups together, culture and mythology developed to support each new level of consciousness, while corresponding political structures developed to meet higher levels of organization, which in turn met higher and higher levels of human need. For example, tribal culture provided safety, authoritarian structures provided order, empire provided power. Wilber's insight is that this is okay, even necessary, that we retain some aspect of the consciousness that drove these earlier stages, because we still need safety, belonging, and some forms of power and order. If we eradicate everything from those early stages, we will not be able to thrive at higher levels of social consciousness. So it's inevitable that the egocentric and the ethnocentric aspects of human consciousness remain strong today, even as we have journeyed and grown through additional stages. Now, a few hundred years ago, modern consciousness emerged in the era known as the Enlightenment, when a critical mass of humanity began to grasp the value of reason and science, which led to industry and global trade. Postmodernism, often associated with liberal intellectuals, sought to move us beyond reason and science. That's a little scary to us now if we think of ourselves as enlightened Unitarians. Well, our Unitarian ancestors were at the forefront of modern Enlightenment thinking that began to overturn traditions and cultures that were rooted in authoritarian structures. And I'm not just talking about scholarly examination of the Bible through a rational point of view that began in the 1600s, leading to what became liberal Christianity in the 18 and 1900s, initiating the backlash known as fundamentalism in the 20th century. And though the 21st century left may feel overwhelmed by fundamentalism, it's liberal Christianity that has become mainline in the 21st century. In another arena, the emerging Enlightenment consciousness found early Unitarians of the 1700s among the elite who promoted and profited from liberal economic ideals that led to free trade with the revolutionary idea that markets should not be dominated by state-sanctioned monopolies. The well-to-do traders of colonial Boston, early funders and founders of Unitarian congregations, promoted and benefited significantly from emerging systems of capitalism and the slave trade. In this same period, the emphasis on reason and science expanded into the philosophical view that anything which exists can be measured. If you want to know what is true, look for the measurable evidence. Within the liberal religious community, this mindset led to humanism, which came to dominate Unitarianism throughout the 20th century. Elsewhere, the emphasis on the material and the measurable eventually evolved into a value system in which the only thing that can matter is matter, the countable, the bottom line. Theologically, this was a trajectory away from dominance by the almighty power of a supernatural God to the elevation of the assumption that individuals could judge for themselves and choose for themselves the difference between right and wrong. This fit nicely with the expanding American sense of independence, where individualism and a corrupted sense of equality, such that every selfish whim is now considered valid, and so-called experts with their fancy education are routinely met with scorn, and public health measures are seen as oppressive and met with the response, "You can't tell me what to do." Wilber's conclusion is that the backslide we are now seeing, the revolt against social diversity and global consciousness, is inevitable. We are on the cusp of a global transformation into a still higher level of consciousness, but we cannot go forward because the excesses of the left and the corruptions of liberal ideals have led us to a dead end. The only way forward, he says, is by first going back, reimagining, but not entirely rejecting the values of our ancestors, and then trying once again to grow into a more inclusive society. We're going to listen now to the old Paul Simon song, American Tune, which you may recognize as still one more rewrite of the traditional Christian hymn that we sang earlier, a song of longing for a world that might live up to its promise.
Many's the time I've been mistaken, and many times confused. Yes, and I've often felt forsaken, and certainly misused. Oh, but I'm all right, I'm all right. I'm just weary to my bones. Still, you don't expect to be bright and bon vivant so far away from home, so far away from home. I don't know a soul who's not been battered. I don't have a friend who feels at ease. I don't know a dream that's not been shattered and driven to its knees. Oh, but it's all right, it's all right, for we lived so well so long. Still, when you think of the road we're traveling on, I wonder what's gone wrong. I can't help it, I just wonder what's gone wrong. And I dreamed I was dying. I dreamed that my soul rose unexpectedly, and looking back down at me, smiled reassuringly. And I dreamed I was flying, and high up above, my eyes can clearly see the Statue of Liberty sailing away to sea. And I dreamed I was flying, come on the ship that sailed the moon. We come in the age's most uncertain hour and sing an American tune. Oh, and it's all right, it's all right. You can't be forever blessed. Still, tomorrow's going to be another working day, and I'm trying to get some rest. That's all I'm trying, to get some rest.
I've taken part in my share of conversations in finance committee and property committee meetings in Unitarian Universalist congregations, where people I know to be liberal in many ways are quick to mention how conservative their estimates are around money or safety. In these contexts, we use the word conservative to mean allowing for a prudent margin of error so that when things go wrong, because they will always go wrong, the consequences will be survivable. For example, in my congregation in Wisconsin, when we put a glass roof over our courtyard, it was designed not only to bear the weight of anticipated snow, but the weight of more snow than had ever fallen. We were conservative. We took seriously the potential consequences of failure if the roof were to collapse. Similarly, I'm accustomed to church budgets being estimated conservatively. That is, approaching potential income as iffy and potential expenses as inevitable. Unitarian Universalism has generally been understood to be a liberal religious movement. Over the past decades, though, along with the general political, social, and religious climate, it feels that we are adrift. Should we be more progressive? Should we use more religious language so as not to alienate more traditional people or spiritual people? Critics who used to call us too free and easy now call us sanctimonious and closed-minded. I'm not saying we should be overly concerned about what other people think of us, but during tumultuous circumstances, we can lose track of ourselves, lose track of our allies, and lose track of our adversaries too, whose rhetoric, behavior, and priorities may seem distressingly fluid. So though we don't want to become obsessed with what others think of us, since we are talking today, among other things, about the powers of misperception, in this era of extreme polarization, I encourage you to consider from time to time, in what areas might others believe that liberal ideals have turned in on themselves? Or to put it more bluntly, in what ways might those on the opposite side of the religious or political spectrum think that your attitudes and actions are hypocritical? Try to consider for just a moment, without defensiveness, why they might believe that. If you care about what message you send to those who disagree with you, if you care about persuading others of the value of your ideals, do you care enough to consider how you are being perceived? Without giving up on the core of your convictions, what might you do to eradicate any glimmer of hypocrisy, which, fair or not, will probably be blown out of proportion and interfere with your message? Would you every once in a while consider the possibility that good ideas can turn in on themselves and become unrecognizable. Psychologist Oliver Sacks has written about a patient with a memory disorder that rendered him unable to recognize not only others, but himself, unable to retain the autobiographical facts which any ordinary person pulls together to establish a sense of self. To compensate for this loss, the patient unconsciously invented countless phantasmagorical narratives about who he was and what he had done in his life, crowding the void of his identity with imagined selves and experiences he fully believed were real, were his own, far surpassing what any one person could compress into a single lifetime. This case was unusual, of course, but it can tell us a bit about how the human mind works. And I think it has something to do with the sense today of our society being adrift. We find ourselves telling stories about ourselves that may or may not how we spoke about ourselves 10 or 30 or 50 years ago. We certainly see this in our adversaries, but we may be blind to it in ourselves. Conservative columnist Bret Stephens wrote last week, "The old liberal left paid attention to complexity, ambiguity, and the gray areas. A sense of complexity induced a measure of doubt, including self-doubt. Once, the left was irreverent. Now, it is pious. Once it believed that truth was best discovered by engaging opposite points of view. Now it believes that truth can be established by eliminating them. Once it cared about process. Now it is obsessed with outcomes." I disagree with much of this, and it would be easy enough to go through this litany of ills to demonstrate how Stephens has misinterpreted, exaggerated, and been caught up in the same kinds of self-reinforcing bubbles that we are all getting caught up in to reinforce his own point of view. But since it's getting harder and harder to look at ourselves in the mirror, because social media is like a badly distorted funhouse mirror, there are probably some things we could learn from the perceptions of others, even when they're upsetting, even when they're off target. There is an old Zen saying, "Do not take offense, even when it is offered." I would add, even when offense is offered, what can I learn from it? The way we apply our political rhetoric to the issues at hand is so dependent upon the context. Take, for example, the history of what liberals today tend to call reproductive rights. In the early 20th century, Margaret Sanger was repeatedly arrested for publishing information about contraception, which she hoped would provide a new level of freedom for women. But by the 1940s and 50s, even Dwight Eisenhower and Barry Goldwater supported contraception because it seemed a sensible conservative response to the threat of global overpopulation. Now, Sanger was devastated by this change of emphasis over the decades, and in the term Planned Parenthood, which she saw was a morphing of the movement in a dangerous way from women's control over their own bodies into a kind of mainstream social engineering. Then scroll forward another 20 years to the 1960s, when Malcolm X was asked to build Black support for this movement. It depends, he said. Is this a movement for liberation or social control? Don't use the rhetoric of birth control. Blacks will not endorse anything that could be perceived as an attempt to control them. So contrary to Sanger, who we call today a paragon of freedom, Malcolm X preferred the term family planning, which Sanger despised. And back and forth, the rhetoric and the politics of reproductive rights have shifted for decades, until by the late 1980s, national polls showed that more Republicans than Democrats were pro-choice. Both liberals and conservatives will probably always have a love-hate relationship with the ideal of individual freedom. Religious liberals have celebrated individual freedom as the ultimate gift through which we can serve God or humanity. Conservatives have condemned religious pluralism for undermining traditional society. In the 1960s and 70s, liberals in both political and religious arenas hailed individualism as an antidote to stifling conformity. But more recently, liberals have been condemning individualism as antisocial. The Unitarian Universalist movement was all about independence from colonial times through the 20th century. But now in our rhetoric, we are wary of independence, and we generally refer to it as antagonistic to interdependence. Both liberals and conservatives have a love-hate relationship with individual freedom. Liberals hold a legitimate resentment toward those who, in the name of personal liberty, shun society except to reap its benefits. And yet perhaps all Americans pledge allegiance to their right to be left alone. As first romanticized, of course, by our own Unitarian hero, Henry David Thoreau, who went off to Walden Pond, voluntarily quarantined, that he might live free. Amen.
And in this time of quarantine, we have less opportunity to share our time and talent within this community. But sharing our treasure is still just as important. And there are 3 ways that you can do that. And you'll have an opportunity to do that in a moment. You can send an old-fashioned check to BUF at 1207 Ellsworth, 98225. You can find the Give button on the webpage at buf.org, or you can use your Give Plus app on your phone. Your contributions help keep BUF afloat and operating in these difficult and perilous times, and we're grateful for them. Thank you.
The offertory today is based on one of our hymns. I'd just like to say that our Singing the Living tradition is full of hymn tunes that have been used by various religious traditions, and in many cases the lyrics have been adopted by the UUA Association. So for instance, what I'm going to play, its technical name as a hymn tune is Lancashire, and it was written a couple of hundred years ago. In the Protestant tradition, it might be called Lead On, O King Eternal. And in our hymnal. We use it at Easter time under the title, O Day of Light and Gladness. We want to thank you for all of your contributions to BUF in all the ways that you show your generosity. Now we're going to sing number 291, Die Gedanken sind frei. And in German, Die Gedanken is thoughts, sind, and remember in German, S is pronounced Z, sind, frei, free. So this is really a fun one to sing. Die Gedanken sind frei, my thoughts freely flower. Die Gedanken sind frei, my thoughts give me power. No scholar can map them, no hunter can trap them, no one can deny. Die Gedanken sind frei, my thoughts are as free as wind or the ocean, and no one can see their form or their motion. No hunter can find them, no trap ever bind them. My lips may be still, but I think what I will. A glimmering fire, the darkness will brighten my soaring desire. All troubles can lighten, no prison enfold me. Its walls cannot hold me, no captive I'll be, for my spirit is free.
Thanks, Melanie. That is a fun song to sing. I'd like to remind you that the monthly Taze service at BUF will happen on, as usual, on the first Monday which is the 7th this month at 7 p.m. at the usual service Zoom address. Taizé services originated in the monastic community in Taizé, France in the 1940s. And at BUF, we've put a UU spin on that. And that service draws from many of our own sources. You can find details about this and other goings on around BUF, even remotely, in the midweek update, which you can subscribe to if you aren't already, from a link at buf.org, where other information and announcements are available. And at this point, we will extinguish our chalice. I'd like to finish today with a thought from Lars Erik Nelson, who is a columnist at the New York Daily News. He unfortunately died of a stroke during the 2000 election recount, but not before he'd broken the story that Katherine Harris, the Attorney General of Florida, was not a neutral party in that recount. Among the pithy quotes he left us with was this one: "The enemy is not conservatism. The enemy is not liberalism. The enemy is BS."
Let's circle around for freedom. And one other thing I forgot to mention was that after the postlude, we will meet for coffee hour. Our Zoom host will divide us up randomly into small groups of 6 to 10, and we'll have a chance to catch up with one another, meet new people, and possibly reflect on the service. And each little segment lasts for about 10 minutes, and then we get rebroken up into new groups. So I hope you'll stay around. And now let's sing.